Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your 10 minutes of ancient warfare for the week, where I attempt to answer a question from a viewer, reader, or listener, and they ask me a question about something ancient warfare related or ancient history related. And in 10 minutes, although the last time I failed abysmally to keep to 10 minutes, I attempt to answer it unless I get distracted, which is entirely probable. Today's question is from user UR4NL6DQ2X. But of course, before then, you can ask a question, send us an email, send us a postcard. You can comment on a previous podcast or video. You can follow us along on Patreon, patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. You can back us at one of three different levels, Legionary, Optio, and Centurion, and even get a copy of the magazine. Now, the question from user UR4 is an interesting one, not necessarily warfare related, but I will twist it to warfare. Question: as someone who has just started my casual deep dive into reading the ancient Greek and Roman writers, who are your go-to translators for your favorite texts? Is more modern generally better? For example, I struggled to get hold of a copy of Herodotus's Histories through my local bookseller. They only had the Penguin Books version by Aubrey de Sélincourt, but I know there is a more modern translation by Tom Holland, not Spiderman. Spiderman. Who's he? It's not Spider-Man. Right. Now, firstly, in defense of Aubrey de Sélincourt, I love Aubrey de Sélincourt's translation. Generally speaking, if it's been published by a reputable publisher, whether it be Oxford or Penguin, the Loeb, obviously the Loeb library. I do have lots of Penguin and Oxford classics too. They're just not behind me. All of those are a good starting point for any translation. One of the things, of course, that is a great advantage of the Loeb Classical Library or the Oxford Classical Texts, or even the Teubner texts if you want them, is of course that they have the original Greek and Latin, which you can go to if you're really interested in a particular word or a particular phrase, and then meticulously go through it with a dictionary, although the online translation services are much better than they used to be for those sorts of things. Now, for me, and I'm probably unusual, I like a literal translation. I don't mind it being clunky and awkward if it gives you the exact sense of what the original says. And if the original is confused and it's like we're not actually sure what this phrase means, I don't mind not knowing that and having a gloss or a note in the text saying this is really unusual. For instance, in Herodotus, when he's talking about Thermopylae, the phrase that's normally translated or explained as being that the 300 men selected by Leonidas were fathers with sons, there's not enough in the Greek to tell you that. That's a whole life's work to explain that anyway. So it's a sort of an approximation by learned translators to say this is what we think it means, but it's not actually that clear. So in that sense, a lot of the Penguins and the Oxford Classics and even the Loeb Library, the translators are fine, very useful. I do, as can be obvious from my bookshelf behind me, try and buy multiple translations. So when they update the Loeb Library, I will buy both and have the early one and the later one and compare. One of my favorite translators is Wilmer Cave Wright, who translated Eunapius and Philostratus' Lives of the Sophists, which is an unusual source. Also translated the works of Julian for the Loeb Classical Library. She's an amazing 19th century female scholar at a time where they were very rare. And the translation put out only last year, I think, 2023, essentially says, look, there's sections of this text where we didn't need to alter Wilmer Cave Wright's translation at all, even though it was made in the 1920s. So that's always a good sign when you have a translation which is so good and reliable, even if the language is a little bit out of date, that it's actually fine. I mean, a bit like the King James Bible, really, that, the translations of a lot of those passages are absolutely bang on, just the language is a little bit out of date. But there are people who prefer that language. My first contact with, my master's degree, my first master's degree was in the stratagems of Polyaenus of Macedon. And the only translation available was the one made in 1793 by the Reverend Richard Shepherd. And while I was doing that thesis, the most recent translation into English came out, and that was by Peter Krentz and Everett Wheeler. So I got that during the time that I was writing the thesis. But I still love the way that the early translation talks about it, and I prefer it in some cases. Some bits of it he went awry, but in other parts of it, the way he expresses the Greek in English is better than the more modern version, in my opinion. And of course, Frontinus and Polyaenus have been translated into multiple languages. Again, my first experience with Frontinus was with the McElwain and Bennett Loeb Classical Library translation, but it's been translated by others. And it's been translated into Polish and Hungarian, which is fantastic. Not that I read Polish and Hungarian. It's great to see that those are being spread around. So I suppose in that sense, any translation you can get your hands on is a good start. Being me, go and get your hands on multiple. If you start with Tom Holland and then read Aubrey de Sélincourt and then read, or can I think off the top of my head who translated Herodotus in the Loeb Classical Library? I can't. Oh, no, gone. Sorry, Loeb Classical Library translator. But any of those, I think, are a good start. And I think that, as you say, it's a casual deep dive, but the whole point of a deep dive is you find a passage or you find a line of text that intrigues you as an English translation. You go and find out the original Greek, or you go and find other people's translations of that line and go, right, well, what does this mean? One of my favorites is the last line of Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand is, they can never take away my panache. Now, that line of French text introduces the word panache into the English language. And I really don't like translations which translate panache as to my big white feather. I think you keep the word panache because we know what panache is, and it doesn't mean big white feather. The feather is a exemplification of that panache. So anyway, I think that in that sense, any translator is a good start. And then you can, start to look at others. There are, Julius Caesar and things like that. There are so many translations available. Some of the oldest ones are actually very, very good. So if you find some from the Bond Classical Library, have I got one close to me? Yes, I do. Oh, which one? Yes, this one. The Bond Classical Library one, they look like this from the 19th century. The translations in those are fantastic and often very dense. You do need your glasses to read them because the text is quite small. But the Ammianus Marcellinus translation is one of the best. This is the Tacitus, which is also very, very good and very, very high quality English translation. They also have quite good notes in them. And of course, a lot of those translations are available online because they are all out of copyright. So you'll find a lot of the New Church Fathers, for instance, for the later 4th and 5th century historians, especially the ecclesiastical historians, they're all available online. And so you can peruse them, at your leisure. And there's a lot to get through. Others are very, very tricky. Until very recently, there was only one translation of Jordanes Getica available, and that was, made in 1915. So it's always nice when there's a new translation of a work that, was very hard to get hold of up until very recently. So in that sense, the newest one is great because it's the only one. In some cases, though, the old ones aren't out of date. They are out of date in the sense that they're old. But what you find if you then get a newer translation and those old translations is you can read them side by side and look at them and go, oh, I like the way he's expressed that, but this is the way that's been expressed in the modern translation. Is there an explanatory note as to why? And then go on from there. So join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers.